Well, thank you very much. I mean, Sue, as you spoke, of course, I recognise lots of points at which our paths crossed each other, and but of course, Sue has really been involved in heritage, as you can hear, for a long while and very continuously, whereas my involvement has been over a long period, but more intermittent. I sometimes wonder whether I should be described as an amateur or a fellow traveller or an interloper or exactly what. But I'm my main occupation has been as a historian. But I got involved in heritage, and I've been involved now over a long period. I realised, looking back, that even before I named it heritage, I was very involved and interested in it. As a fourth-year student at Melbourne University, I undertook a thesis on 19th century Richmond, and I had a camera, and I was going around back streets. In those days, heritage had not arrived in Richmond. I'm talking now about the early 1960s. But I would walk around the streets photographing buildings. And one afternoon I was walking down Docker Street, and I had an old car which had I had required maintenance, and in my bag I had various tools, a hammer and a wrench and a couple of cameras. And I was walking down the street when I noticed there was a car following me down powder blue Holden. And as I hastened, as these two rather sinister-looking fellows sitting in the car came abreast of me, and suddenly one jumped out and grabbed me and put me in the back seat. And of course, these were a couple of plainclothes coppers from the Richmond CIB, and they began to go through the contents of my bag. And of course, they found all these incriminating things like, housebreaking implements. So that was for me a bit of a kind of an epiphany. I realised that eventually I got wriggled out of this, but I realised that history and heritage could really be rather interesting. And I then later on, I wrote a PhD thesis on the rise and fall of Marvellous Melbourne. I did most of it while I was in Canberra. And I realised, looking back, how visually illiterate I was. I mean, I wrote that book out of textual sources and with very little understanding at that point of the physical elements of it. And it was only when I got back to Melbourne and Frank Strawn recruited me onto the Industrial Heritage Committee of the National Trust. And we started to go out into the country exploring old mining sites and flour mills and all sorts of other things, that my education really began. As Sue reminded you, in 1974, the passage of the Historic Buildings Act really was an important moment in the history of heritage in Victoria. And not long afterwards, in about 1977, I got a call from Boyce Pizzey, who was then the director of I suppose he was the director of the Historic Buildings Council rather than Heritage Branch, because there wasn't one at that stage, asking me if I'd like to join because they thought they needed a historian. At that point, heritage business was very largely initiated and sustained by architects and architectural historians. But of course, the Act itself required them to take into account historical as well as architectural aspects of heritage. And I was kind of drafted onto this committee, and that's where my learning really began. I thought that the 4 years that I initially spent on the council, when we toured country districts, when I looked over the shoulders of architectural historians interpreting buildings, that was when I really think I began to get a real feel for heritage. In 1981, I went from Melbourne University to Monash as a professor of history, and for the next few years I was expected immediately to become, professors had to head their department. So I resigned from the Heritage Council, or the Historic Buildings Council it was then, and then a couple of years later I was invited to come back as chair, and I did about another, I think it was another 4 years on the council at the time that Sue was around. And during that time I felt that it was a highly contested period of heritage. Sue will remember those interminable hearings that we had on central city buildings particularly. And I was the first non-lawyer to chair this tribunal. We had these big set piece hearings with QCs and barristers and so on. It was a very intense learning period. I suspect more as much political learning as interpretive learning. I resigned in 1988, again, because I was going off to a visiting position in America. And when I came back, I began a process of trying to actually distill so much of what I'd learned. I was involved with others in writing a book called A Heritage Handbook, which was an early attempt to try and bring historical interpretation into more line with the sophistication that architects had already developed. I was invited to write I gave a talk while I was chair to the Law Institute on what makes a building historic. That little pamphlet then got widely circulated and I think influenced thinking about that subject quite a bit. The other thing that after I got back is that I began to think about how we could actually try and train a cohort of historians to work in fields like heritage and museums. And we established a public history program, a master's program at Monash. And a number of people who are still active in heritage in Victoria are people who graduated through that program. The program itself no longer exists, but it was important, I think. I also, Sue reminded me when she mentioned World Heritage, I was also involved for a little while on a federal government committee on World Heritage. The need to iron out some understandings against the Forests Agreement in the 90s required the establishment of a federal committee. And I served on that for quite a while. And that was probably my first engagement with what to me was a rather strange and arcane process involved with World Heritage. But one of the seeds that I sowed in that process was to direct attention away. We were concerned at that moment with natural heritage particularly, but I sowed the seed of the Royal Exhibition Building being considered as a potential World Heritage candidate. I was also involved a lot at that time, perhaps more involved with museums than I was with heritage. I became an advisor to the National Museum of Australia. I helped to write a history of the Powerhouse Museum. I was an advisor to Museum Victoria. But I found in all of that the experience that I'd had in interpreting buildings was an extremely valuable basis for then beginning to look more closely at how you interpret objects. And some of the elements of contestation around buildings were also very relevant to the issues, again, highly political engagement that I had then. And we also, I got one of those mysterious telephone calls that comes one day from a fellow called Gary Grimmer, who was an American who'd just been appointed the head of the Melbourne Convention and Marketing Bureau. And his last job had been in Boston, where he had managed the famous Freedom Trail in Boston, which some of you might know about. It's a heritage trail that links the major sites in particularly revolutionary Boston. And he said, Melbourne needs something like that, doesn't it? And I called, I don't know whether he or I called Ray Tonkin, and the three of us conspired to begin what became the Golden Mile Heritage Trail. The trail's there still it's the first of, well, there have been heritage trails before it, and there are of course many more since. Looking back, I'm ashamed that we made practically no acknowledgement of Indigenous heritage in that first draft of the thing. But what was important for me, thinking of heritage, is that it brought back to the forefront of my mind the point that successful heritage evaluation relies in turn, and even statutory protection relies in turn on the process of education, of public education. It's what sustains the whole heritage activity is public support for it. And that Golden Mile thing was I think a useful attempt to try and do that. More recent years, I've come back occasionally as a consultant or advisor or participant. I was involved recently as an advisor on the Palace Theatre at the top of Burke Street. I gave a consultant's opinion on the Whitlam House in Kew. Not a popular view I took. I actually said I didn't think it should be kept. I was involved with others on the Heritage, the Federation Square issue. Those are some of the things that have primarily involved me. One of my concerns these days, I suppose one of the things I come back to is the point I made before, is that I've been involved, as Sue has, in a period that has seen heritage develop from essentially part-time amateur activist activity to a much more professional and bureaucratized activity. And there's been enormous gains in that process in terms of the level of sophistication and refinement that's now applied to heritage. But what mothers me most these days is the popular base still there at the way it was. I mean, in the days when Evan Walker invited me to become chair of the council, he'd come off a period of activism in the Collins Street defence movement before he became minister. And that experience of activism and involvement in heritage battles, I think, was really integral to the success of the movement that followed in the statutory sense. So I suppose one of the things I'd be wanting still to say is that it's important to keep that connection between popular support for heritage, amateur enthusiasm for heritage, and the professional and bureaucratic side.